We're let's start with Birchot Torah, and then we can kibitz a little bit more. Okay, I have three sources with staples. Now, so if you got one with staples in it, hold on to it for dear life. It's a collector's item. We're gonna have sources without staples, but we do have half and half. And Eden is doing everything.
I need the original again.
Oh, you need the original. Okay, I'll use the one. The Torah blessings are on the screen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu Shekhin Shalom V'Zosaf Tzivanu V'Divrei Torah. All right, so Baruch haba to people who are usually not here because they're on Zoom. Good, they're not here; they're there. But and also Baruch haba to all the people on Zoom. Good morning, good Shabbos. We're going to bring up the source sheet.
Shabbos.
Can you guys hear us? Can I hope? Let's get out this. Share your screen. I need Catherine. Can you help me with the screen sharing?
Caroline, yes, I can share the source sheet for you.
Okay, thank Caroline, and keep correcting me. So I appreciate it. So we're gonna learn together. Thank you. We're looking at a moment in this morning's Torah reading. Morning, Thomas. We're looking at a moment in this morning's Torah reading that is very perplexing and very troubling. And Rabbi Shai Held, your friend and a colleague and teacher from Hadar, has an insight into this based on a teaching from a scholar named Baruch Levine, which is, I think, very unique. We'll get to that a little bit later on. But first, let's talk about a background. Let's give a little context for this moment, this part of this morning's Torah reading, where silence appears. And so we look at a couple of psukim, a couple of verses from the rest of the Torah, from the rest of the Tanakh, really, and a little bit from the rabbis and the Gemara, and from the period, the rabbinic period, on what silence means. Like, what's the meaning of silence, right? What's the sound of silence? So we look here at the first source is from the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the first chapter of ethics of our fathers, or ethics of the ancestors. Shimon beno Omer. Shimon, his son, used to say, all of my life I grew up amongst the sages. By the way, some homes have have pets, like dogs and cats and parrots. We have flies. I think this is the same fly that has been in Romemu from like the last 6 years.
Does it have a name?
It doesn't have a name. If you'd like, you're more than welcome. It's an open. It's a fundraising opportunity. Anybody want to name the fly?
That's what I said.
Yeah, exactly, Rabbi. Exactly. It's a rabbinical fly. It's McFly. It's Rabbi McFly. Okay, it's bug. It's okay. One of my enduring frustrations with Safaria, this website that we use, this amazing resource, is that it doesn't have a word it doesn't have the ability to move text around on pages and stuff and save space. It's like once you put a source up, they have like their algorithmic, so you'll see on the second side you have like one source at the top of the page, a little bit wasteful. Okay, so back to the Pirkei Avos. I grew up amongst sages, and I didn't find, it's interesting, for the body, there's nothing greater for the body, there was no greater good for the body than silence. Amazing statement. He didn't say "V'lo matzati leneshama lanefesh." He said, I didn't find silence, right? I didn't think anything better for the body, not keto, not aerobics and high intensity interval training, and not tava. None of the approaches to the body were as successful for the body as shtika, as silence. It's an amazing assertion. The rest of the assertion we can just read, but that's not what we're focusing on. But look at the word for silence. The word here used for silence is shtika. Shtika, lishtok. Very, in modern Hebrew, if you want to say to somebody, shut up, you say, shtok, be quiet. Right? Shtika, ishtok, shtika. Lo midrash hu yikar el ha'maisa v'cholomar b'dvarim medichet. So he finishes his aphoristic teaching, saying like it's not like the midrash, meaning it's not enough to be a nice academic in the abstract. One has to actually be in action, and also uh, the more words, the more sin. So that's kind of like of a piece with the first part of the triptych. So like be quiet, don't speak a lot, and do a lot. Okay, so that's one image, and the word there, just remember the word is shtika. Very different word is used if you look at source 3. I don't know why the source's numbers didn't come up, but source 3, right there, Kohelet in Ecclesiastes in chapter 3, morning. People are known, famous, that's famous, right? There's a time for this, a time for that in the book of Ecclesiastes, right? A time for this, a time for that. So there's a time to rip. See source 3, right here. 8 likrava, 8 4. There's a time for ripping or tearing, and a time for mending or sewing. And then there's 8 lachshot, the 8 lidaber. The second word for silence is lachashot, to be quiet. Chash. You hear chash, quiet, right? The word speak here is the same word as before, dibur, but here lachashot is the second word in the lexicon of silence, and it's used in a number of other places. In Mecharish Tacharishi, there's also lacharish, like amten tacharishun. It's similar. So there's a lot of words for silence, but here's the word that we're going to focus on, which is the second source from Psalm 65, verse 2. Lecha dumiyat ilah. For you, silence, God, is praise. Or the word here befits you, dumiyah. Like this is interesting. Okay, I'm sorry. So let me back it up. Let me give you the straight meaning of this word, and then how it later became to be understood. So dumiyah from the word lidamot, which means like it is similar to you. Lidamot, it's like a similitude. Dimion, like the idea of the imagination. So to you, God, praise is befitting or is appropriate. Is the way that the word dumiyah, the second word here, is right. It is used, and but the rabbis say ulachai shulam neder, and the end of the verse is and vows are paid to you. Okay, vows and praise for you, God. But the way that the rabbis understand this, if you look here at source, I want to be able to share the screen. So easier for me. I want to be in control.
Are you not-
Okay, let's look at, and there are no source numbers, so it's like, okay. If you look at the next source on the other side of the page, on the big side with very small source, which is a big side, small source. It's a Native American name for the sheets. Okay, Darash, I know it's okay. Darash Rabbi Yehuda, Ish Kvar Giboraya. Darash Rabbi Yehuda, Ish Kvar Giboraya. That Rabbi Yehuda, the man of Kfar Giboraya, said, and also some say Amrila Ish Kfar Gibor Chayil. Some say he was a man of Kfar Gibor Chayil. What is the meaning of the verse that we just read in Psalm 65? Right? You see where we are?
Yeah.
What's the meaning of this verse that we just read? The Chad Dumiyati Ilah. Right now, again, in the way that you saw that the way that it was translated by those who are very critically like they're very interested in the etymology of this particular word and its usage here in Psalms for in the classic, in the more accurate reading of this or rendering of that verse, it's praise befits you. The word dumiyah means to befit. That's the etymological. But the rabbis don't hear the word dumiyah as befitting. Praise befits you, but rather look at the way the rabbis read it. Your silence is praise. The word dumiyah here means silence, and in that way, it actually turns the prerogative or the injunction to praise God. It's fitting to praise you. To the only way to praise you is to not praise you. The more we praise you, the less accurate it would be, and so it would be better. It would be better if you were to be quiet, because that silence would be golden. It would be louder than any praise that we could adjure to you. Look at this. The sima de kula mashtuka. The best remedy of all things, the optimum form of praising, is silence. Now that's a heavy thing, right? It's a paradox of sorts, right? Why not try to exhaust? We do that every morning. Like what we could. Sounds very Theravedic Buddhist. All of a sudden, we would come here, and on Shabbat morning, instead of doing all of the psalms that we try to do, we would just be silent for a half hour. And it's like, let me. I see a lot of this. This is probably the only shul in the world where people are like, great. Let's ring the bell. Let's just ring the bell and just be, in silence. We used to do that a little bit. We used to have a half hour pre-pray. We could just be silent the way that the early masters were. This great phrase, Ki asa Rav Dimi. Rav Dimi came from Yerushalayim. Rabbi Dimi, Rav Dimi, whose name, by the way, just thinking about it now, his name means it's from Dumya, right? It's interesting. Rav Dimi. It's very similar to what we're talking about. Rav Dimi, maybe Rabbi of silent rabbi, shows up from Jerusalem. And he says, B'ma'arava, in the West, meaning in Jerusalem, in Israel, they have an adage. Mila v'sela, a word is worth $1. Mashtuka, silence for $2. I don't think we Jews have those kinds of sayings anymore. It's like, where is that? Maybe the first source about Kol Yamai Gadalti Ben Chachamim B'lo Matzati the Guf, right? Tov El Shtika. That maybe that was our saying. I don't know.
Quick one word.
A dollar for that. Does anybody want to be? Okay, go ahead.
That the great grandson of Baal Shem Tov, I've forgotten his name.
Nachman?
Yeah, Nachman, Rabbi Nachman, said, after you pray, listen, just listen.
Right.
In other words,
nice. Like that. No words. Yeah. Oh, after you speak, then you make room for silence to append itself to it, so you can hear an answer. Or beautiful. What's the most famous? Maybe the word, like where mama or dome comes to mean silence. We're going to look at it right now, but I'll just give a second place. Right, we're going to look at the first place, but the second place, perhaps that is most well known, is with Elijah the prophet. Right, when Elijah the prophet is in the cleft, is waiting to hear God's voice, and it wasn't in the loud, right? It wasn't in the storm. It was in the cold mama daka, right? The sound of the mama. The still small voice. People heard that? The still small voice. So in the still part of that phrase is the mama. So let's look at it. The first place that it's likely, the most famous place here is in the story, chapter 10 of the book of Leviticus, this morning's Torah reading. We talked about it last night. It's the horrible story of Nadav and Avihu. Let's read it, okay? We're on the next page, Caroline. Page 3. Bnei Aaron, Nadav Avihu. Nadav and Avihu, names in the Bible are also instructive. Nadav means volunteer or generosity. And Avihu means he's my dad. So these two sons of Aaron are generous, and he's my dad. And they come and they take their censer, which is a pan, and like Nula and Aish, they put fire, which means coals. They put coals into the pan. By a similar ketoret, and then they put incense on top of the coals, so that it would create, right, an and incense. The house, the space would be full of incense. Vayakrivu lifnei Adonai, they came close to God. And Eish Zarash Tzivautam, an alien or strange fire that was not commanded of them. Vatetze Eish milifnei Adonai v'tochalotam vayamutu lifnei Adonai. And a fire came out from God and ate them or consumed them, and they died before God. These two verses are everything, right? Like, we don't really know anything about the story other than these two verses. They come immediately after the previous couple of verses that had already described Aaron and Moshe blessing the people going in and sacrificing for the first time on the eighth day, right, the day after the completion of the preparation of the tabernacle. Moses and Aaron go into the Mishkan, and they fire up the altar and they get it going, and they place the appropriate offering onto the altar, and then in exactly the same language as we just saw, fire descends. The four words, a fire comes out from God and consumes what's on the altar. The people see it. It's great. Vayaronu, they scream out. They're excited, and they fall on they blew up in the heaven. They fall on their faces in what would seem to be numinosity, like they're aware of something miraculous is taking place. It's all good. It's a great thing. Nobody's upset. And then these two verses kind of completely destroy the mood, to say the least. And not only but the language, like in the parallelism between what has just taken place and language used there, and not almost, the exact same language being used now for the mirror image of what is going, is a traumatic moment, is striking. And what is also striking is how sparse this is. Like the only thing here that would give us a clue that something had gone awry, there are no staples. You have to take the whole thing. Okay. Yeah, you got it. That the only thing that gives us a sense that something bad is happening is that it says Vayakrivu, right, the end of verse 4. Vayakrivu lifnei Adonai eish zara. They brought a fire that is zara. Zara in the Bible is not a good thing. Zara means to be inappropriate, to enter into the worship sanctum. Zar, a zar is something is zar means it's not allowed in, right? Something that's impermissible. Zar later becomes even worse. In rabbinic language, it becomes completely foreign and alien. But then, as if that were not enough, the Torah goes on to say, "Asher lo tzivav tamim." So it was not commanded, right? You might have thought it's enough to hear that it's eish zara, but then the Torah repeats. It was not only alien, but it was also asher lo tzivav tam, wasn't commanded of them. And that lends itself to the belief that what happens here, of course, is sinful, and that what comes from heaven is a punishment and not a receiving of a gift, but a response to an inappropriate Promethean moment of stealing fire that should not be stolen. And this is the slap on the wrist, so to speak, for all generations, right? That, of course, is not the only interpretation. We talked about this last night and last year and years before that. There are essentially two camps, maybe three, where those who say this is a sin, they go looking for it. It's either the fire, or maybe it was the fact that they drank wine and they came in drunk, or like there are all kinds of exegetically imaginative ways to find fault with these seemingly innocent young men. But
last year you spoke about
neurodivergence, right? There's going to be like there are ways to understand this, right? And there's the school of thought in that school of thought, which is this is a story of that is like in the Hasidic. Well, it's earlier than that. Philo of Alexandria, and then we looked at Or Chaim in the 15th century and others who see this actually as a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story of two beautiful souls that wanted more than just, they didn't want their body, basically. They wanted to be with God. And God kissed them. They came, and that's one rendering. It becomes the backdrop of a lot of martyrology in Judaism. A lot of the framing of dying for God in our tradition is not killing others for God, it's dying for God. A willingness to give oneself over, either in sweet, as the Chaim said, in ni'imut, mitikut, whatever, or right? There are ways to work with it. There's this neurodivergent children that this would happen to anyone who's not towing the party line. The Hasidim clearly thought that they were Nadav and Avihu in certain ways, and there are many who said they were Nadav and Avihu, and God was going to punish them for bringing their foreign fire. They said, no, we think that they died in a kiss with God. Okay, generations are fighting about this, but clearly from the text seems prima facie, like the simple meaning of the text seems to be this is not a great moment, right? This doesn't seem to be the greatest moment for Aaron, who's the father of these two boys. As much as later tradition wants to read it potentially in a positive way, the next verse is hard to read that way. It's very hard to read it this way. So it says in verse 3, we're on verse 3 now. Thank you, Caroline, with the cursor moving all around. Vayomer Moshe el Aaron. Like the very first person to speak after this tragedy is Moses. And who does he speak to? His brother, Aaron. This is what God has said, saying, the Krovai et Kadesh, through those who I'm close with. Krovai is those who are close, or those who come close. I will be sanctified. V'al pnei kol ha'am ikaved, and in front and before the entire nation, I will be glorified, or gravitas will be conferred upon me. And what's Aaron's response? Va'yidom Aharon. And Aaron was silent. This is the most famous usage of that phrase, of that word, dmama. It happens here, and not only does it happen, it doesn't happen here in the context of, well, maybe it does, but it doesn't happen explicitly in the context of praising God, as Psalm 65, right? To you, Dumia is praise. It's not a still small voice like in Elijah the prophet, and he heard a kol dimama daka, a still small voice. It seems to be a direct response to something being said in the context of a great tragedy. And it also seems to be in response to an assertion from Moses that seems to try to make an attempt to confirm meaning upon what would seem to be, at face value, almost meaningless moment. And in some way, even without getting into secondary commentaries here, again, it's hard to read this filter-free. Like filter-free reading is almost impossible. But it's almost like there's a setup here between a synoptic setup between the two brothers and their responses to this moment. The younger brother, the one whose nephews have been killed, turns to Aaron and maybe should be silent. And Moshe and Aaron maybe should be the one to say, don't worry. This is what God meant when God said, we don't know where God said this. By the way, a lot of ink is spilled trying to figure out where, like Moshe's quoting God from somewhere. And we're like, look through the Bible, trying to find out where God said this. It's not at all clear anywhere that God said this verse, this phrase, the Krovai Kadesh, to those who I am close to, I will be sanctified. And Aaron is silent.
12.
Even Aaron would say that, hey, Moshe, don't worry. This is the meaning that I'm making of this. But Moshe makes the meaning. So is Aaron's silence his silence to what happened to his sons, or silence to what Moshe says to him? So it's like a good question, right? If you're tracking here, like, Vayidom Aaron and Aaron was silent. Is the Torah setting these two up as two responses, distinct responses to the event? Or is Aaron in conversation with his brother? Is Aaron saying, like, I have something to say about what happened with my kids, but when you interrupted me, you should not have spoken, Moshe. It was for me to speak first, not you. And you should not have said a word. And to your absurd remark, I can't do anything but be silent. Right? What can I possibly say? You've broken the sanctity of this moment. Like I haven't, and all of a sudden you're giving me almost like Jobian, theological gymnastics. Like God is great. This is what God said, and I was like, okay,
One of the greatest British patrician insults, if you're a very posh British person, you say to someone, you have earned my silence.
you've earned my silence. And that's not acquiescence.
No, it's
That's
one of the most
aggressive.
insulting things.
It's most so you've earned my silence. That's good. That's good. So that's there might be if you want to say something here in the Zumagog. I don't know what's going on over there. I can barely see, but for those, did everybody hear what Thomas said?
No.
So Thomas was saying that in England, one of the things that you can say to somebody as an insult is you've earned my silence. Right? You've earned my silence. Like, like it's not that I have nothing to respond to you, but nothing. What you said is not worthy of anything, right? I'm not even going to. Or in English we'd say like we have that isn't even worthy of a response. It's not
Great
even
humility.
It's
right.
even stronger because Aaron is the one who is the voice of Moses, who
Right.
speaks for Moses. He's very verbal.
Mm.
I mean, here he's
Right. Very good, Nikki. So Muhammad said that in the Torah, the caricature, the archetype of Aaron is the speaking one, as it were. He's called Elohim. He's like the prophet for Moses. Moses says, "Lo ish devarim anochi." I'm not a man of words. And then God said, "Okay, I'll give you Aaron." So it's very pronounced here that they are now they flip, right?
Yeah.
That Moshe has words and Aaron only has silence. And so I just want to look at the rest of the scene because we'll move into trying to understand his silence through other commentaries about Aaron's silence, okay?
Yeah.
If we look, I want to go back, Caroline, to the end of the scene. Thank you so much. Verse 4, and then we'll go to the commentaries. And if there are people who are raising their hands, I can't see because the shared screen is blocking that, so I can't really see if there are people who have
We do have one comment, Jay. Yeah.
Can I speak?
No, by Dome Jay. Jay, you have to be silent.
I set you up. I'm a good setup man.
I appreciate that. See Pisces in you. Go ahead, brother.
So far, it seems like we're focusing on the silence as a reaction to Moshe's words, but couldn't the silence be a reaction to the incident? I mean, he could be in shock. He could be what he's just witnessed, and in fact, the fact that all the usual rituals of mourning are also prohibited. I mean, there's no words, there's no action, there's no way you can really react to what just happened.
Right. So I thank you for bringing that back. I thought I'd set it up this way. We were focusing on what in that moment they asked the question open-ended, is Aaron's silence referencing Moses or to the event? But certainly we're going to move into seeing his silence in response more obviously to the event itself. And for that purpose, again, let's look at the rest of, thank you, Jay. Let's look at that is a good segue, good setup, man. Again, for the rest of the verse, let's look at verse 4, 5 throughout, and we'll come back. No, stay there, Caroline. Verses. Okay, got it. Vayikra Moshe el Mishael ve'el Tzafan, bnei Uziel dod Aaron. So Moses calls Mishael el Tzafan, the children of Uziel, the uncle or the cousin of Aaron, which is also the uncle of Moses. Anyway, who are these guys? Why did he call them? They must not have been already. They're presumably people who are not sanctified to stay in the inner sanctum, and so their contact with the dead bodies would not defile them and make them invalidate them to then continue the service, as it were. He called outsiders, right?
Yeah.
But outsiders who are implicated in this because they're family, right? Vayomer Alehem, this word appears already. This is the fourth time it appears in two different forms. One form is the form of coming close, as in a korban, bringing close something to the holy, and also relatives. The same word used for coming close, korban or lehakriv, to come close, and as a relative. So also what's pronounced about this entire episode is that it happens with that word appearing in a very informative way. it's very fructive. That it's excitingly, philologically exciting. It's like the fact that the word to come close to God would seem to be the sin is also the word used by Moses, where he says, "By those who come close, I will be made right to have glory." That weird phrase that's used from somewhere. He quotes God. What? And then also these are relatives that come to take out the bodies. And then the relatives have to come close to get the bodies. That word that over and over again, like there's something very important about that, about mourning and about death and about um, relationships and about the 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 ways that we are tethered to one another. So the kirvu se'ut achechem eis b'nei hakodesh l'michutz l'machana says, come close, lift up your brothers, again, relatives, closeness, family, from the eighth Pnei Kodesh, from within the holy space, and bring them michutz lamachna, to outside of the camp. Verse 5, Vayikrevu, and they did come close. And you notice that Vayikrevu in verse 5 is very similar. It's exactly the same word to Vayakrivu, right, in verse 1. Right? They came close in verse 1, which there means they came close to sacrifice. And here's Vayikrevu, they came close. Same thing, but here they're bringing out the bodies. They lifted them by their kutonet, which is like their tunic, to the outside of the camp. Kasher diber Moshe, as Moshe had spoken. Right here it means as Moshe had commanded them to do, but it's also Moshe's the speaker in the whole scene. As Moses the speaker had spoken. And then Moshe says to Aaron, and then to the two remaining boys, Elazar and Tamar, Rashechem al tifrau v'digdechem lo tufromu, lo tamutu, v'al kol eida yiksof, v'achechem kol bet Yisrael yivku et ha-sirfa asher saraf Adonai. He says to them, your mourning practices here are not appropriate. Do not, uncover your hair, and your clothing also don't tear or and rend your clothing, so that you don't die, because you have to do the work. You have to continue doing what you were appointed to do, and let your brothers. The second time the word brothers appears in this piece, let your brothers, the house of Israel, cry the burning that God has burned. Right? And from the opening of the tent of meeting, don't leave. The word lo tetz'u is very powerful, because that's exactly the fire that came out of God. It was vayetz, they came out, but you can't go out. You have to stay within your boundaries. You have upon you the oil of anointing, and they did according to Moshe's instructions as he had spoken. Now, if you turn now to the next source, look at Rashi's understanding of Vayidom. Kibel schar al shtikato. Aaron received some reward for his silence. What reward did he receive? In the very next part of the Torah, right after this tragedy, God will give the instructions to the priest not to drink wine when they enter into the holy sanctuary, which of course that was what the rabbis who said that they were drunk when they entered into the sanctuary hung their exegetical hats on, right? Because they said, oh, why would God choose this moment to tell them not to be drunk? Must have been that the kids were drunk, right? So don't you do that ever again. But when that is given, when those instructions are given, it's given directly to Aaron and not to Moses. So Aaron gets a unique, God gives him as a reward. I spoke to you directly. I didn't speak to Moshe to give it to you. It's not such a great reward, maybe. I don't know. Maybe it is. I don't know. Maybe Aaron wouldn't have wanted it. Nobody asked Aaron. Like, it's like an interesting midrashic moment. Maybe Aaron, would you trade in your two kids and never have to speak to God ever again? Did you want to say something, Wendy? Or?
If I could.
Oh, you came around. I'm sorry, because I don't have
Yeah.
eyes behind me. It's true.
God only speaks to Aaron twice in the Torah. The first time is when he tells him to come to Moses, and it says Vayomer. This time, it says Vidaber. He spoke to him as opposed to he said. So that it's a little bit different. And this is the final time that God speaks to Aaron. And the only thing he says to him is, "Don't come to work drunk." You know, and it's very curious that he only speaks to him twice, and the two times are where it seems like later on, like in the traveling in the desert, he would have spoken to him again, or towards the end of his life, and yet this is the final time that God speaks to Aaron, and he tells him, "Don't get drunk when you go to work," after losing his two sons.
So okay. So maybe God. So let's come back to that. Like why God might have spoken in here. It seems from Rashi that in this tradition that it was a reward of some kind for being quiet. Maybe and it's interesting that Rashi uses the words of Vayikra Rabbah, Leviticus Rabbah, the Midrashic and also the Gemara and Zvachim al shtikato, on his silence. Right? He uses the wrong word. Like Aaron is not shtika, is not silent. It says in the Torah that Vayidom, he was the mama, he was domain. So anyway, so in that universe of rabbinic discourse, like to be silent here is to not, like Aaron might have yelled about it, might have, like, in other words, there's a certain what's called in the tradition, he was willing to accept God's judgment, as it were. Right? It's called Siduk Adin. Like God is the true judge. I have every reason to scream at you, God, but I was not rare. Like I didn't bring a plaint. I wasn't a plaintiff. You know, I didn't bring you to judgment, God. I didn't make a claim. I didn't sue you in the heavenly court. And so his silence here is interpreted as a certain source of piety, and he's rewarded. And couldn't get a better reward in the rabbinic mind here than God speaking to you in the very next moment. We're going to keep going. I want to keep going because I want to hear what other people in the text have said, and then we'll come back.
But I about the text.
But I just want to okay, go ahead.
Okay, so before we get to the place where the sons die, there are two parts I thought was interesting where Moses said to us, if we bring sacrifices, then the glory of the Lord will appear to you. And also it says that once the sacrifices have been made, Aaron and Moses are supposed to come out of into the tent meeting or out to us and to say that the Lord, the glory of the Lord will appear to us. Do you think that has anything to do with with how Aaron reacts here, or God's reaction?
I'm not sure.
Okay.
Let's get to the end.
Hello.
I prepared the shiur to get to the end of the shiur. That was the goal of the shiur, is to get to the end of the shiur, and I want to get. Okay,
I'm
somebody
sorry.
needs to be
So,
silent. God here.
so it's Shabbos, and Romemu does a Torah
Thanks,
study,
Caroline.
and it's called
Caroline,
Open Book
Caroline, can you
from
mute?
I'm currently trying to find
8:45
it.
to
Yes.
9:45.
No, just mute
So
everybody.
I'm trying to multitask.
Sorry.
No.
Thank you. Okay. Thanks for the shtika. Okay, let's look at the Barbanel. Silence. Barbanel, the next source. Isaac ben Yehuda Barbanel. So Vayidom Aaron. So this is coming right back to Jay. Vayidom Aaron, Barbanel back in the 15th century says the word Vayidom is from the word domain, which means a mineral. Domain in Hebrew is, in the rabbinic Hebrew in particular, is classifies life as, like, there's 4 levels of life. There's right, and domain is the inanimate. Like, so the domer chaim medaber, like, so the domain is not speaking, it's not alive, but its silence comes from it being it's inanimate. And so he says, Vayidom Aaron, his heart turned to a lifeless stone. He did not weep or mourn like a bereaved father, nor did he accept Moshe's consolation for his soul, had left him and he was speechless. So this speaks to again to a kind of what Jay was saying about shock. That Aaron here like he can't respond to Moshe, he can't respond to what just took place. He's completely domain, like he's in complete and abject, inanimate, like he's become unable to he can't. He's completely in shock. Like Dom Aaron is not some lofty, supra-rational, holy piety. It's not some inner, like, oh, is this related to what happened before? He just cannot believe what just took place. It wasn't anticipated. It wasn't expected. It makes no sense to him. His heart is completely unable to weep, unable to grieve. He's not able to respond to Moshe Vayidom. And so in the Abarbanel's reading, the choice of this word is absolutely instructive. His Dumama, his domain, is being silent. It's immediately connected to the domain of inanimate objects. It's not shtika. It's not any of those other words for silence. It's uniquely like a rock. He's turned to rock. Now, in the next source, the Shem Olam from Eliezer Lichtenstein is actually completely the opposite. If you can imagine two texts that are speaking completely at odds with one another, these two commentators are completely at odds with one another. So look at this is the next source, probably the Shem Olam. In the Shem Olam, he says Scripture chose Vayidom rather than Vayishtok. The latter signifies the abstention from speaking, weeping, and moaning, or any other outward manifestation, as they reel to and fro and stagger like a drunken man. Followed by, then they are glad because Yishtoku, they are quiet. He quotes a source from Psalm 107, which indicates that the word shtika is kind of like the absence of sound. Like they were running around making a lot of noise. They were like drunken people, and then like they were not vayishtoku. They were not quiet. And there, shtika for this commentator is uniquely about loud. Like when your watch tells you that you're in a loud environment, it's decibel related. Like shtika would only, if that verb had been chosen, would have been that there was an absence of sound in the world. That's what the Shem Olam says. But for the Shem Olam, the Mamak here, Vayidom, is actually more than that. It wasn't just that Aaron didn't speak, but something else was happening for him. The exact opposite of the Barbanel. He says the verb domain, however, connotes inner peace and calm. Like he was like a rock, but not like a rock in his inability to articulate like an inanimate object, but rather he was so uniquely able at that moment to remain calm, preternaturally calm, in ways that maybe others would have been like, "What's wrong with you?" Right? We would probably say like, "You're in shock." He said, "No, I'm not in shock." So it's just it'll happen later on. You'll get it. No, he was completely equanimous. There was a certain level of equanimity that the rock here, right, is an expression of. Accordingly, Scripture describes the saintly Aaron as Vayidom, not merely as Vayishtok, thus emphasizing that his heart and soul were at peace within, that rather than questioning the standards of God, he justified the divine verdict, right? So Aaron and in this model it's extremely maybe say part of the many religious pieces of literature that see kind of a lack of emotional response to an impossible emotional situation as a sign of piety, as a sign of evolution, a sign of spiritual attainment. There are many, many stories. I know you're asking, I know if you grew up in the Orthodox world like I did, and certainly if you grew up in the yeshivish world, there are many, many of these stories about great, great, holy, always men that you hear about, holy men who were able, whose equanimity or whose emotional, stoicism was seen as a sign of great piety. I mean, one of the most famous was Rabbi Eliezer Wasserman, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, rather, who was a great rabbi who was murdered by the Nazis. I remember hearing a story about how he heard on Shabbat, you're not allowed to mourn on Shabbat. On Shabbat, he heard about the death of one of his kids. And the students were amazed that he could continue to be joyous on Shabbat. And then, of course, as soon as Shabbat was over, he fell on the floor and started to weep. But this was a sign, like he didn't give in, like his capacity to be emotionally in charge, to have that kind of ba'alut, ownership over his emotions, was seen as a great virtue. Now, the next interpretation actually will come back. It'll be completely different than either one of these. One where he's in shock, which seems to be the simple meaning of the text, by the way. And Jay's interpretation of like traumatic response. And this rather difficult, although it's still used to this day, Vayidom Aaron, Vayidom is still used as a kind of very high level of equanimity and trust in God. I want to look at Baruch Levine's here, the last couple of sources, to read this again completely differently. Okay? You with me? Bottom of page 4.
Yeah.
The accepted interpretation of Leviticus 110:3b is that Aaron remained silent or was stunned upon learning of the sudden death of his two sons, Nadav and Avihu. The verbal root DMM, Damam, to be still, right? We'll call this, he calls this Damama, DMM1, right? To distinguish it from the next moment, is morphologically indicated in biblical Hebrew, so that initially there is no problem in reading that part of the verse in the accepted way. In other words, there is ample evidence, as we just pointed out, for seeing the word Dmama or domain, vayidom, as inanimate or silent or still. Right? We just went through that. That's the last an hour of that, right? 45 minutes. Both the comparative and the inner biblical evidence to be adduced presently will, however, suggest an alternate rendering. He says, let's look at it this maybe in an alternate way. And Aaron, instead of Aaron, was silent, and Aaron mourned. Instead of the word dom meaning to be silent, he wants to argue it means, and Aaron mourned. This rendering identifies in Leviticus 10:3b a homonymous Hebrew root, here to be classified as DMM2, which is to moan or mourn. Understood this way, Leviticus 10:3b means that Aaron reacted in the customary manner. He moaned or wailed and was about to initiate formal mourning and lamentation for his two lost sons. Once this line of interpretation is considered, the commentator will read the remainder of Leviticus 10 differently. Immediately after the bodies of the two dead sons of Aaron had been taken outside the encampment for burial, Moses issues instructions to Aaron and his two remaining sons not to engage in formal mourning by baring their heads and rending their garments, lest they meet death and arouse God's wrath against the Israelite community. Rather, the entire house of Israel was to act in their stead and mourn. The verb bechi, to weep, the untimely death of the two priests. Mourning even over a son or brother would have defiled Aaron and his two remaining priestly sons at a time when their purification was just taking hold. Read in this way, Leviticus 10 actually achieves a higher degree of symmetry. Well, he doesn't bring the morphological evidence, but there is evidence to see the word or the same verb here used for silence as to moan or mourn. And if that's true in his rendering, what happens is that he is mourning, he is moaning, Vayidom Aaron, he's mourning, and then he's about to move into the classical or the biblically classical ways of mourning, and Moses stops him and says, no, now's not the time for that. The children of Israel will mourn in your place for you, which is also very poignant and beautiful, right? The children of Israel will mourn for you, will cry for you. So I think it in that way, we have it's just a very different reading of the text. It's just a very different moment.
Yeah.
Aaron's silence is not present, but Moshe is still what Moshe says to Aaron is still inappropriate in some way. Aaron is mourning. Moshe begins right with a kind of explanation, just like Job's. The next source is uh, Job's inappropriate ways that he was approached by his friends, right? Um, but the mourner, Aaron, nonetheless, Aaron's silence and his mourning are nonetheless codified in Jewish law as the appropriate response in the house of a mourner. Not Moshe's response, but the response of silence, either the silence of the griever or the silence of the one who visits. So the last part of this, I want to just look at um, this last Talmudic piece, like some of the customs of mourning and the responsibilities of those who mourn with. Right? Look at the last source here, and then we'll take questions and comments in a moment. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Ein menachamin r'sha'im lamar davar ad yiftach avel. So the source that we didn't read right before this in chapter 3 of Eov, right? It teaches a law, and it's a law that in almost every house of mourning in the Jewish world that is a traditional house of mourning is known. No one who comes to comfort a mourner may say anything until the one who is mourning opens the conversation. You are to sit in silence, not offer words of comfort, not give excuses, not even try your best, nothing until the mourner speaks to you.
Unlike Moses.
Unlike Moses.
Yeah.
Unlike Moses, which is amazing. If you go mitzvah, right? A mourner, and then we can go into what else is okay, whatever. I don't want to go into the next the remainder of this because it's sufficient. Like this is the halacha when it comes to silence. So I'm going to open this up for comments and for questions, and then I'll close it again. So let's go to the Zoom since we've only heard one person in the Zoom. I saw a
We
couple
have
of
Asher,
hands.
Asher Haim, and then Roberta. Yeah.
Great, Asher Chaim. Rabbeinu, go ahead.
Thank you, Kvod Harav. I thank Wendy for pointing out the 2 times that God speaks to Aharon directly. And this does lead me back, because the first time was in the context of the call of Moshe. And the call of Moshe, God overcomes Moshe's reluctance by saying, Ki ehyeh imach, I will be with you. And here, after this shocking, outrageous death, God speaks directly to Aharon.
Yeah.
God is present with Aharon intimately in a way that doesn't happen. And when God says, don't hide behind alcohol, this brings me back to Noah, who reacted post-traumatic by drinking alcohol, and everything devolved.
Right.
So here, I think, differing from Wendy, it's not your boys were punished because they were drunk, now you don't drink, but rather your boys died, and it probably had nothing to do with alcohol. But I know it is human for you to want to
Right.
anesthetize yourself. And instead of that, please accept my presence as giving you enough strength to keep on functioning without numbing yourself. Dibarti.
Shemati, I just want to be clear though that it wasn't the interpretation of the don't drink alcohol is from Chazal, which I know you know that it wasn't Wendy, but Chazal are the rabbis who are the ones who see this juxtaposition of these 2 parts of the Torah, one to the other, as teaching those, like that's they they deduce from that that must have been one of the sins. Of course, the rabbis, as I said last night, are searching for meaning, and that search for meaning is to make of them the seemingly meaningless and capricious and cruel events, to give it some patina of meaning, even if that patina is, morally problematic. It's like, rather know why they died, even if the reason is worse than not having a reason, is the rabbi's, MO. And I love your pastoral read, Asher Chaim. I think it's brilliant that, just like in Noah, reading the last time people got drunk, like Noah, right after the flood, après le deluge, he goes in Vayita Karem, and he plants a vineyard, and he gets drunk. Vayishkar b'toch ha'olo, he gets drunk in his tent, and that becomes the reason why he's not chosen actually as the Avraham, right? He loses, right? And here, I thought you were going to go in a different place, which was also, there were like at least 3 different places that you brought me to in that. One was, you said ki eyeimach, that God said to Aaron, to Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe says, I don't want to speak, and God says, well, wait a second, I'm going to be with you, right? I'm going to be with you. It's not going to be, it's going to be difficult, but I'll be with you. And then Moshe's like, it's not enough. I need Aaron, right? And Aaron. And I thought you were going to say, and I think maybe you did, on some neshama level, we're saying this, that even here, when God speaks to Aaron, he's also saying to him, even though he couches it in the language of law, he's also saying, I'm going to be with you as you struggle through this period of mourning. And then I also thought you were going to say something else, which was that the reason why God speaks to Moshe here, to Aaron here, is not because of a reward, because the only other person to speak to him was Moshe, and Moshe spoke the wrong way. And God was coming to speak to Aaron to say, clearly Moshe has a speech problem. And we all know that, right? He doesn't know it. He can't speak sometimes he does speak. This is very blasphemous of me to say this, but again, okay, so blasphemous. But like God saying, Moshe tried to speak with you, wasn't exactly the right thing. So let me speak to you. And just as you were the voice for Moshe before, I recognize that if it had been you, you would have said the right thing, maybe. And I'm going to speak to you, Aaron. I don't know, something in there, but I love what you said also. It's very beautiful. Okay. Yasher koach to you, Rabbeinu. Roberta, and then we'll come back into the room. Roberta.
Yeah, Shabbat Shalom. I really love the interpretation that you gave us from Baruch Levine, that Aaron was mourning. And because what I take from that is that Moses was protecting Aaron, giving him the space to have his own experience, and that there's a beautiful teaching here on communication, the way we could be with each other in the face of intense suffering, which is, and that is, I think, what the practice in Shiva is about. Like, just give people their space to suffer, to feel, to mourn in whatever way they need to, like people shouldn't feel compelled to have words for their experience. And so Moses is protecting him in a way. And for me, I kept looking at this going, why does it keep saying twice, if otherwise you will die, don't rend your clothes, don't, I don't have it right in front of me, but otherwise, you'll die. And it's like, if we don't have the space, if people don't protect us, this is like right out of trauma healing, really, right? If we're not given the space to mourn in our own way, to integrate our experience in our own way, right? A part of us dies, it gets frozen off and becomes trauma. So I love finding compassionate, life-serving interpretations of these really challenging events in Torah. So thank you.
Yeah, and I want to add a gloss to that, is that in the context, if we take that thread, it actually, if we read it that way, it's actually slightly different. Meaning, if God is saying, or Moshe is saying, don't engage in mourning practices now, otherwise you will die, this actually works slight against the grain of typical trauma response understanding now, in that it's telling the 2 remaining kids and Aaron to stay focused on doing for a moment, but don't go to the place of mourning. you're in the midst of something right now, stay there. That energy that you'll use for your life, that you're continuing your life, not avoiding the morning, but like now's not the time. Continue to do your functions is a separate, maybe equal, different response to thawing out and being in silence and being in shiva. Like it's slightly different, but it's equally instructive. As there are a number of ways to work with trauma and shock, and all of them seem to be present in this piece of the Torah for sure. So okay, so we're coming back into the room. We have a couple of comments, and then we're going to close. We're going to start with Nikki.
It's on Aaron's silence. It reminds me of the Wordsworth poem. I think it's the Intimations Ode, where he ends by saying, "There are thoughts too deep for tears."
There are thoughts too deep for tears. Yeah.
Yes, that.
Yes. Yes. Thoughts too deep for tears. I mean, listen, this is also, this is not true. Adorno apparently didn't say this. There's a lot of debate about whether Adorno is misquoted here, Theodore, but he said after the Holocaust, poetry, but it's not, he didn't say it exactly, but it's a similar sentiment, right? Which is that this moment in Torah is so shocking. I say this every year. This story is repeated 3 other times in the Torah. And it's as if it has to continue to be repeated because we can't work it through exactly. It's kind of, it doesn't lend itself. It does not lend itself to any meaning making. And that was the source of the Torah I gave over last night in the shul, where I talked about that this is such a great mythical story about the danger of being given power. I personally think my personal interpretation of these 2 stories together, the story of the accepted offering and then this offering. In fact, I think what Moshe is saying it to him is this is a kind of offering, right? When he says this is what God said, I will be made heavy by those who are offered on my behalf. This becomes a part of, like, in some sense, the mystery of God. God's kavod is not God's proximity, but God's transcendence. The mystery of God is expressed and exemplified in our mind's incapacity to make sense in this world of suffering, especially suffering that happens to innocent people. It's not God in the world, but it's a reality in the world. It's incarnation writ large. Suffering is real. Things happen that we completely can make no sense of. And that's not a way to make God great, but to maintain the mystery of creation itself. We don't get it. And no scientist, with all of their ability to absolutely identify the moment of creation and how the mechanism, can't explain to us the existence of the beauty of a flower and the terror of an earthquake. We just can't make sense of it. We can't. And so here, these 2 things are juxtaposed. The fire that descends from heaven is exactly the same fire that consumes on the altar, and then exactly the same fire that comes and consumes these two children, as if to say, you can't have one without the other. I'm sorry. Like, heaven doesn't give halves, right? Fire is what it is. Heaven does not give halves. And I think that Aaron's silence, the way that Rav Nachman would read his silence, is the only way that we can understand suffering of that magnitude, is to enter its mystery with radical humility and silence, not even protest. Not even protest, although protest is also a very relevant form of mitigating suffering. In the face of this more ontological question, Aaron's silence is just, it's not the surrender of piety, but the surrender of the mind that will never make that Mobius strip make any, it won't ever be solved. Anyway, that was I should have finished on that, but there are other people, so good. Go ahead, brother.
So I think that's really interesting what you're saying. So to me, the whole issue of all the death that happens in the Mishkan itself, we're
Yes.
constantly killing.
Constantly killing things, yeah.
And what you said last week, I thought was so poignant about how we're supposed to bring something perfect and then it goes up in flames. And it doesn't really say that God needs this and like maybe it's destroying the perfect. Do you think there's some of that in this? I mean, it's terrible it is that the sons died. That on some level they had reached their pinnacle, they had served their purpose, and
So they one way to read it. That's the very Hasidic way to read it. It has real heft in Jewish
rational.
history.
It's
It's very rational.
Yeah.
Exactly. There's a way that, you know, when people say that, you know, that child finished their service in the world, whatever it might be,
Yes.
you know, I personally believe there's truth to that at times. You know, I'm sure it's true sometimes. It must be true sometimes, but I don't know that I could possibly be in a position to weigh in on that. It's certainly a legitimate spiritual pathway in our tradition, but it has to sit with somebody. I think, you know, every one of these explanations has to sit with the person, and the problem often becomes when we try to force what sits with me onto what doesn't sit with you, right? It's like it makes sense to me, but it has to make sense to you, because if it doesn't make sense to you, then how can it make sense to me? I won't be at peace until it makes sense for you. Me too. Yeah, yeah, and then we're coming to Thomas. I saw the last word. Yeah,
For me,
Zatya.
for me, it's the whole reading from the beginning to now is a big lesson on ego, you know, and when to hold your, and then I think about Aaron, his leading people with the golden calf and how he never received any punishment for that. I mean, with the golden calf that he, and so I think we have to keep holding, like Yetzirah and Yetzirah, you know, it's the whole thing, and holding the two elements like that, you know, when to speak, when not to speak, and when to mourn and when not to mourn. It's constantly seeing the difference and what you can agree with and what you can be silent about.
Yeah.
Shemati.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Okay, Thomas.
Two thoughts I was just itching to say briefly in honor of the hour. The first is as the ambassador from Christianity. The one of the things that really bothered the first writers of the so-called New Testament in the book of Genesis is that there are these great divisions in the beginning between darkness and light, between earth and water or whatever. And one thing that isn't divided is silence and sound.
Mm.
Quiet and noise. Like that's never mentioned, and it really, really bothered the early fathers, supposedly of Christianity, under the influence of the Greeks, but for whom sound was really important. And so St. John, who writes the first gospel, like rewrites the first words of Genesis and says, "In the beginning was the Word,
Right.
and the Word was God, and the Word was with God." And what they mean is that God is language, and language is the integration of sound and silence, always already the two, that we need the noise and then we need the silence between the words or the white space between the black letters. And it's already like radically integrated in God. So there's never a division between silence and noise. That's why St. John presumes to rewrite Genesis, which is a whole other problem. And then secondly, you know, God famously, we are told, is one, right? But everyone else in this story is two. And as a twin, and as a twin brother, it really gets my attention that we have Nadab and Abihu, Moses and Aaron, Mishael and Elzaphan, Eleazar and Ithamar.
Yeah.
So nobody goes into this story alone. Everyone has a listener and witness. And I think it really reinforces your interpretation, Rabbi, that the silence we're hearing about is not Aaron's silence before God, but Aaron's silence before Moses.
Yes.
That it's the silence between two people. It's not a generic silence, it's a reciprocal, held or suffered silence between two people. It's an intimate silence, not a universal silence, would be my reinforcement of your take.
Cool.
I was just thinking this word that appeared that was so odd, the word dode, which means uncle, and it's made of $2. Like it's a strange word.
But yeah, the uncle is one.
The uncle, it's like the uncle, and he's mentioned like he's in there, and he's dode is to the same letter twice. Dode. It's like, you know, it's another one of these pairings. Yeah, I think this story when I was in Israel and I went to the Nova site, I talked about this last week, but this, we have the 6-month anniversary of the hostages. And one of the things that's most painful, I think, in Israel is that if you're in limbo and you can't mourn, and so many of the hostage families don't know if their loved ones are dead or not. And that's a huge problem. And the nation is mourning for them sometimes, but they're holding hope. And the story is very resonant. And I think I talked about this. I didn't talk about this last week, but I didn't talk about it last night either. But one of the more common names after the 1973 Yom Kippur War given to children after that war was Nadav. And I heard from someone because when I was at the Nova site with our group from Romemu, I immediately started to think about the story. And when I was asked to give a Dvar Torah, I spoke only about Nadav and Abihu and about the silence. And when we were obviously walking around, it's, as Roberta said, you're in the presence of suffering that is on a scale that these young kids were at the Nova Festival and peace loving, blissing out, and hiding in like Jews from Poland in 1942, just in Israel. So the silence is